Okay. So hope you had a great weekend. Is this one? So anybody remembers what we saw last class? Last week? Well, we discussed about models in science and, well, not only in science, but models in general, how we perceive the world and its limitations, advantages, disadvantages. I mean, of course, science has its limits, but it's the best game in town. I mean, it's the best we have to getting to know our world, and even with its flaws and, let's say, all the things that we cannot know is the best thing we have to get to know things. Uh, and of course, given that it has limitations, it's useful to be aware of these limitations rather than to assume that, let's say, we will always get to the final truth, which, as we discussed, there is no such thing as a final truth. But that doesn't mean that science is not useful. So let's say it's like trying to find at the same time the valuable things and the limitations. And today we're going to speak briefly about emergence. So we already discussed about emergence. Uh, what what was the idea that you remember about emergence? So let's just see. For example, this it's a white blood cell chasing a bacterium. It's around our red blood cells. So at the end, we could say that it's just lots of molecules that are interacting. But then uh, molecules are not alive. The cells are alive. Where does life come from? And there are different approaches to this question. One that would be reductionist would be like, well, yeah, we could in principle describe everything in terms uh, uh, of the molecules as it was discussed by Phil Anderson. I mean, not that he discussed this, but he was mentioning molecular biologists thinking that this could be possible. And then what we perceive as life is just an epiphenomenon, meaning that it's not really there. It's just something that conveniently our perception detects regularities, but in reality, it's just the movement of molecules, and it can be described like that. And let's say something that most people would agree is when we speak about emergence is that, okay, yes, these properties we call life emerge from the interactions of molecules. But then, let's say, indeed, it's a useful description because of the statistical regularities, and then that has advantages, not to describe all the intricacies of the molecular level. However, a stronger view of emergence would be that the life properties, or let's say these emergent properties, have a causal influence on the molecules. And the argument would be that without having these macroscopic properties that we call life, that yes, they are a product of interactions, but without those, then you wouldn't have other molecules at the lower level. So there are many molecules that are synthesized only by living systems. I mean, proteins cannot be uh, synthesized by non-living systems. And in particular, in cells, you have RNA that builds proteins, and then, of course, those proteins have a function, and then the function of those proteins has been evolved throughout millions of years. So if we don't include all that process of multiple scales up to the level of the biosphere, we cannot explain the molecules. So that would be a more contemporary view, but it's not accepted still by many because it kind of tells you that you can't really say much about life, or let's say it highlights some of the limitations that we have when we study emergent phenomena. But let's go back a bit in history. And so, as we mentioned, the concept is not entirely new. In antiquity, people already spoke about something like emergence. So Aristotle spoke about whole being more than the sum of its parts, and there are plenty of examples of this. And in the 19th century, there was a philosophical movement known as British emergentism. And let's say I'm not going to read all of those works by different people. But then, let's say in the 1930s, there was a big success from molecular biology and also from quantum physics. So that led to reductionism, and kind of people forgot about emergence, and it even became taboo in many fields. And this was the case until computers became common in 1980s, maybe a bit earlier in specific places, but let's say it kind of became mainstream in the 1980s, 1990s. And again, just to repeat, one of the problems of people referring to emergence in those decades, now still, but almost nobody speaks about emergence as being surprising, because then if for something to be emergent has to surprise us, then it's basically a measure of our ignorance, because once we observe a phenomena, and an emergent phenomena, and we understand it and we're no longer surprised, then it wouldn't be emergent because we're not surprised anymore. So as Phil Anderson wrote in 72, it's not, let's say, so much to do with the observer. I mean, it has to do with the observer, but there's also an ontological aspect to it. And he gives the example of gold, that even if we know all the properties of the atoms of gold, that will not tell us much about its malleability, its conductivity, color, let's say macroscopic properties that are not mysterious, they're not surprising, but you cannot derive them from the elements. And we also mentioned in a similar vein about properties of carbon molecules, that it's the same components, but depending on how they're interacting, how they're arranged, the materials that those atoms form will have very different properties. So we can have graphite, which is opaque and let's say not very hard, diamonds, which are shiny and very hard, graphene, which is a very good conductor and very strong, well, stronger than steel, and so on. So from the properties of carbon atoms, we are unable to distinguish whether a specific atom is part of a diamond or graphene or graphite or other molecule, or if it's part of a biological molecule. So let's say once computers became widespread, then let's say the study of emergence kind of arose again. And as Murray Gell-Mann, he was contemporary of Phil Anderson. They were both Nobel Prize winners. They were both at the Santa Fe Institute. And Murray Gell-Mann did many contributions. One of those is the name Quark. So he has popular book, you might have heard about it, The Quark and the Jaguar. And what he said that it's not that reductionism is wrong, it's just that it's incomplete. So it's useful if we're interested in the questions that reductionism is able to answer. But then there are so many questions that reductionism is unsuitable for addressing. So on the one hand, reductionism tells us that if we go to a lowest scale, then we'll be able to predict everything that goes to a higher scale. But first of all, we don't know what's the lowest scale. Maybe it's elementary particles. Maybe elementary particles can be subdivided. And let's say the limitations are not only in that direction, but as we mentioned, simply the combinatorics of the amount of elements interacting, since they explode, even with the most powerful computer, we are unable to predict or to reduce the something as simple as a bacterium running away from a white blood cell to its molecular components. I mean, we understand the chemical reactions and everything, but to do a molecular level simulation is just way too much, and to explore that with a high level of detail. And one example of emergent phenomenon is Mexican wave. So maybe you have seen it. Didn't originate in Mexico because, from what I understand, in baseball stadiums, people were doing it already for ages. But in the World Cup of 1986, no, or was it 1970? Well, one of those World Cups that Mexico organized. This year will be the third. Yeah, I remember that 1970 was the first World Cup that was televised in color. So that was like a big thing. And I don't know whether that made it that it was like worldwide distribution or something like that. So anyway, it's known as Mexican wave. So have you experienced it? I mean, we can do it. So it's very easy. We can start here. You can raise your hands, and then you raise your hands. Can I have your attention for 1 second? Everybody? So we're going to do a Mexican wave. You can start here. You raise your hands, and then you raise your hands, and then you raise. Okay. Okay. Again, a bit faster. And now backwards. Yeah. So it's very easy. You don't need to have global information. When your neighbor stands or raises their hands, then you do it. And then at the stadium level, let's say, looks like this. And then we can argue whether there's downward causation or not, because it's like, is the wave real or an epiphenomenon? But anyway, as we mentioned, we can say that emergence is information that is not present at one scale, but is present at another scale. And this contains many of the notions of emergence that there are many in the literature. So, for example, in the game of life, that we have these simple rules, and then we can observe movement of structures like gliders and spaceships. We can speak about weak emergence in the sense that there are only the rules of the game of life that define the next state. And then an observer will say, oh, there's movement, but then we can say that that movement is in the observer, not in the game of life, because there's no downward causation. Strong emergence includes downward causation. So for example, social norms, we can say that individuals define social norms, like what is good, what is bad, what's admissible, what isn't, what's considered good manners or fashionable. Language, it's also built in a similar way. And once that this social aspect has certain identity, then it influences individual behavior. So we would say that it's not possible to predict or understand individual behavior without understanding this downward causation. And then right now we will speak about the problems of downward causation in general. So synchronic would be emergence in time and diachronic in space. So for example, traffic jams, depending on the behavior of individuals and the density, mainly the density, but also in the behavior of individuals, you can have traffic jams with higher or lower densities. And crystals, they basically form in space, and let's say it's also chemical process, which is more or less well understood. But in a way, it can also be difficult to predict because, let's say, all its richness. So, for example, you might have heard that there's no you cannot find two snowflakes that are the same. They're all crystals of the same water molecule. So you more or less can say, okay, if it gets a bit too cold, you'll have water crystals. But since they depend on so many factors, how they will start crystallizing, and then depending on how they start crystallizing, the shape of the next crystals will be defined. It's also very difficult to predict. I I don't know much details about crystals. Maybe under some circumstances you can predict something, but I'm not sure. I I mean from what I understand, snowflakes, they kind of start from a speck of dust, and then water molecules start adhering to it, and then since the no speck of dust is identical, then the shape at which the molecules start adhering determines the shape of the snowflake, and that makes them unique. So, which is macroscopic. Yeah. So, and depending on levels of abstraction, we usually speak about upwards emergence. So, for example, syntax, where let's say we have letters that form words that form phrases. We can speak about transversal, which could be semantics, in the sense that different agents can agree on the meaning of symbols, and that would be at the same level. And downwards, as the example we mentioned of biological molecules that require not only life but a whole biosphere in order to be able to produce. In a similar way, plastic bottles. I heard this example from Sarah Mary Walker. By themselves, they're no. I mean, they don't have organic molecules, but you need a civilization with economy and oil processing and many other details so that you could produce plastic bottles. So if we would find a plastic bottle in Mars, it's not like a direct sign of life, but it would mean that the civilization produced that plastic bottle. And similar for other, let's say, simple molecules, that the way that they are arranged or organized by a civilization implies that there was much higher complexity that produced through downward emergence this new information at the molecular level or at the chemical level. All the chemicals that our species has produced, even the elements that are not found in nature, that we have made in accelerators, I mean, they're, let's say, atomic elements. They're in the periodic table. But in order to exist, they require a high technology civilization. Uh, and that's why it's information that was not at the atomic level, and now there is. So that's why we can call it emergence, but it will be downwards because, let's say, it's a lower level of organization. So the downward causation has been perhaps the one of the most controversial topics related to emergence. And it has to do with many different things. So from what we discuss about how we describe our world, what we consider to be real, because if we describe downward causation from an epistemological perspective, it's one thing. If we want to consider it an ontological reality, then it's a different thing. In other words, if we assume that downward causation is just a way of describing phenomena, it's kind of less strong than if we say that downward causation is something real independent of observers. And uh, as we mentioned last week, really we cannot separate epistemology and ontology because, of course, we need some sort of reality that we can agree on and contrast different explanations of that reality. But let's say the moment we are using language and concepts such as causation, it's already dependent on an observer. So it would be almost an oxymoron to speak about uh, describing something independent of an observer, because if you don't have an observer, you cannot describe it. So let's say we cannot have pure ontology, we cannot have pure epistemology, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to describe, let's say, precisely what ontology and epistemology study, but we just have to be aware of their limitations and their interdependency. Uh, any opinions about downward causation? Do you believe in it or not? Am I selling it right? Could you say yes or no, whether you believe in downward causation or not? Why? Wait. Mhm. Mhm. Well, well, let's say if we speak independent of an observer, then there are also no levels of abstraction. So, I mean, it is observers who define abstraction levels. So something like downward causation, by definition, requires those levels, and in reality, those levels don't exist. So things just happen in parallel, like at all levels of abstraction at the same time. So yeah, it's difficult to say. Yep. Mhm. Mhm.
Are you asking if it would affect in social behaviors?
Yeah, the question was whether you believe in downward causation or not. Just yes, no. Where?
I I would say yes, I believe it happens.
Yep.
What
Seems we're all believers. Mhm. Very rigorous.
Sometimes there's something, serendipity or something.
Mhm.
It's really hard to say that the causation, but that was just my.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes.
Catching up with the past, but from what I understand, downward causation is about how high level to the lower level meaning is found. It has an intuitive sense to it, as in breakdown systems, you have its core, that is a purpose, but I'm not sure if there's evidence for it. I feel it's more of a like a intuitive constructive build. So it's cliche, but I think somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Mental model of sorts.
Yes. Andrea?
I do believe in it. I think whether you go up or down, I feel like everything's dependent on one another.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also believe, but doesn't matter. The question is whether it's useful. And then that question would be also difficult to answer because it depends on the specific conditions. So in some situations, it wouldn't be useful to speak about downward causation. And in some other, like in sociology and economy, in biology, I think it is useful to speak about downward causation independently on whether it's just an epiphenomenon, let's say a description or something that we are imagining, let's say some statistical regularity, or whether it's something really there. But yeah. And so perhaps one of the added complications about the discussion of downward causation is that in the 90s, most people, when they spoke about downward causation, they were using consciousness as an example, which in itself it's perhaps even more controversial and confusing and ill-defined than emergence. Maybe not, but let's say they're like on the same level of I wouldn't say pseudoscience because there's strong science, but um, there's such an inherent subjectivism about emergence and about consciousness that makes traditional science difficult because in traditional science we can agree on, let's say, even when there's a subjective component, we can agree on saying, okay, we will observe this phenomenon from this perspective and we will use this language, and then we can contrast theories and make experiments and so on. And in emergence and consciousness, there are so many different perspectives and so many definitions that still there's ongoing debates about what is consciousness, how to measure it, and not so much. I mean, not necessarily uh, in a mystic sense, but for example, when a patient is in a coma or with anesthesia, we want to know whether they're conscious or not. You know, especially if they're in a coma, if they're not responsive, but in some cases they seem to have certain brain activity that might imply that they're conscious. In some others, they're clearly not conscious, but we don't really know. I mean, ideally, there would be sufficient differences in brain activity in different cases, and then we will have enough cases of people who came out of a coma, and then we can ask them, oh, do you remember this or that? What you were in a coma, and then we will be able to compare, but let's say that hasn't been possible. So there are some approaches like integrated information theory proposed by Giulio Tononi and others from University of Wisconsin in Madison, where they look at the information content of brain signals, and then depending on that, they assume whether there is consciousness or not. A drawback with that measure of based on information, which is similar to the drawbacks of the other measures based on information that we have seen here, is that in principle you can try to measure the consciousness of any information string that you find, and then it turns out that some information strings turn out with a high consciousness degree. And the same you could do with complexity, with emergence, and so on. But of course, the interpretation of the measure is more important than the number that the equation gives you. So if you take it out of context, then it can give you, let's say, weird interpretations. And let's say our challenge is that, let's say, if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. So the fact that we use our brain to understand our world makes it such a complex thing that to understand our brain with our brains becomes almost an oxymoron. So of course, if we have a model of the brain that is simple enough so that we can understand it, then that model of the brain shouldn't be able to do as much as our brains. Well, that's more or less what this quote is saying. I forget from which year, but it's not recent. Maybe from the 1930s. And I mean, we can speak also about emergence in biospheres. So most of the research of origins of life in times of Darwin or Oparin, Lascano, and many others, they speak about a warm little pond. So basically they focus on where on Earth could life have evolved from non-life. And then you might know that there are two theories, whether first was metabolism or first was RNA with information. And it's a bit of a debate because you need both to have life. So then it's like, okay, in which conditions you could have complex molecules that are self-sustaining, because let's say life, it's a process that produces itself. So that's why this concept of autopoiesis proposed by Maturana and Varela, which means self-producing. And then if life produces itself, we end up with a chicken and egg problem, because if all the life we know came from life, then where does the first life came from? And of course, there are many theories. And on the one hand, some people have shown that with abiotic chemistry, you can have the properties of life. So you don't really need the life molecules to have life-like chemistry. And on the other hand, let's say, I remember there was this project PACE, European project. Which year was it? I don't know, early in the century, so a bit more than 20 years ago. And the goal of this project was to do protocells. So an artificial protocell that would have metabolism, information, and membrane. Yeah, so information processing. And relatively quickly, they were able to have metabolism, and also the goal was that these protocells would be like 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the smallest cells. So they had the metabolism like in some capillary vessels, not vessels, yeah, like chemical reaction that was metabolism, not in the cells, but like in some controlled nanotubules. Then another group was doing protocells, and so people are still working on this. So they call it also active matter, because you can see these or active droplets. There are these droplets that move around. Maybe I should get some videos for this. Let me see. So let's say some complex chemical reactions that give you something like cell membranes, and then they split, and then they reproduce, and then they move, and then they can follow light and things like that. Oh, yeah. So, for example, there is this. Don't worry, we will not watch all of it. It's just to. Okay. So, I mean, of course, the subtitles are adding some anthropomorphic interpretation to the chemistry. And then finally, I forgot what they were using for information processing, but back in the day, Ricard Soler used to say like, oh yeah, in a year we will put all these three together, metabolism, information processing, and membranes. And I don't know, I met him before the pandemic, and I said, remember that you were saying that every year, like it was just 1 year away, and this was like 10 years later. I said, oh yeah, I was more optimistic back then. And yeah, now it's not, nobody tries to make predictions about when we will be able to make life from scratch. But let's say it's in the early in the century, people were very enthusiastic that we would be able to do life from scratch laboratory. And then, well, some people say that the laboratory of Craig Venter, they did life from scratch. It's not really from scratch, because they took the genome of a bacterium, they extract of most of things, and then they synthesized that genome with PCR, and then they put it into empty membrane, which was also from a cell. So it's like, and then they kickstarted like Frankenstein, and then it's alive. But then the thing is not that they made it from scratch, because they use all the pieces from living systems. Yeah. So. The question is that the conditions that allowed this warm little pond to exist, the right concentrations of different molecules, couldn't have been local. They had to be at the biosphere level. So we need to consider in the origin of life not only the local conditions, but the global conditions that allowed the local conditions to have the first cells. In the sense that if there was too much oxygen or too few oxygen, then you wouldn't be able to have those right conditions in the warm little pond. And that's something that is still unknown, because our simulations of whole protobiospheres are quite rudimentary, and people in search for life in other planets are also interested, because it's like, okay, if we can perceive certain composition of some atmospheres, what's the probability that there is life in those exoplanets? Yeah, so we discussed a bit about whether emergence is epistemic or ontological, whether it's just a description or whether there's really something there. So it might be that we cannot say that it's only epistemic, or perhaps weak emergence is only epistemic, and then maybe strong emergence is ontological or partly ontological, because again, even if there's something real that, let's say, it's not only in observers, we need an observer to describe it. And we also have the same about causality. So we speak about causality very naturally. I mean, since times of Aristotle and Hegel and Kant, they speak about different types of causes. And in medicine, we want to see what's the cause of a disease. Let's say for infectious disease, okay, what causes cholera, Vibrio cholerae, what causes influenza, different viruses. And let's say, even if that's a description of a phenomena, it's very useful because that has allowed us to treat and prevent many infectious diseases. And in a similar vein, we're interested in, what causes cancer. It's much more complex because there's not a single cause. So people call these multifactorial diseases or complex diseases or non-transmittable diseases. And this applies to cardiovascular, to hepatic diseases of the liver, diabetes, cancers. Yeah. And there's not a single factor because it depends a bit on your genes, it depends a bit on your habits, it depends a bit on your environment, it depends a bit on some other things, a bit of chance, in the sense that, and in a way, infectious disease, it's also like, okay, there is a cause, but let's say, what's the minimum concentration of a virus that you need in order to become infected with that virus? And we don't know, because different people need different concentrations. And then there are different circumstances. If your immune level is down, if it's a bit more responsive. So, of course, babies and elderly or immunocompromised people will have very different tolerance to different viruses concentrations. So, I mean, in a way, for infectious diseases, there are also many causes, even when we can point what's the agent that caused the infection. But still, in non-infectious disease or in complex diseases, it becomes very particular. So it's difficult to say. And if we go into mental diseases and conditions, it's even more specific, an individual. So we want to know what are the causes of those diseases, but then we don't really have a good notion of what causality is. It says, what does it mean that something that A causes B? And let's say, ideally, it's like, okay, if when B there is A and when there is no A, there is no B, then in some circumstances it works like that. But first of all, when you want to infer causality from statistical data, you have spurious correlations, and then it's very difficult. There's no recipe to say, okay, this is correlation and this is causation. I mean, it's almost like a a phrase that has been inscribed in many places. Correlation is not causation, but we don't have a straightforward way of distinguishing them. So it becomes very particular. And of course, there are different experiments that we can do to try to be more convinced that there is some causation, but let's say we are not able to do all the necessary experiments, and we cannot be sure completely. So let's say we have some confidence that there is causation, but there are always exceptions. So yeah, we also have that problem with causality in general, independently. I mean, we don't need to speak about downward causation or circular causation. That can also be problematic for some people. And I like this quote from Schrödinger because let's say it's about what we mentioned, that we cannot really do without epistemology or ontology. We need both. So in times of early days of quantum mechanics, again, there was this discussion on what's in the observer and what's really there, independent on the observer. Because if you recall, some aspects of quantum mechanics depend on how you make a measurement. So there was this idea that some people, like Einstein, would say, oh, but then that means that reality depends on the observer. And they didn't believe that. And well, Schrödinger wrote, inspired a bit by Vedic philosophy, I believe. The world is given to me only once, not one existent and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of recent experience in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist. So we can ask better when it's useful to describe something as emergent. And I mean, we already discussed a bit about this, so it's not so much. I mean, of course, it doesn't mean that doesn't matter what we believe. It does matter, but in a scientific process, it's like, okay, is it useful for my explanation, for my prediction, for my modeling, to use the concept of emergence, and which flavor of emergence or not? If we don't need it, then what for to use it? But in any case, we can say that we need to go beyond materialism, in sense that materialism assumes that only matter and energy are real, and an alternative would be to consider information as real, and of course that involves a partially subjective approach. So I want to briefly mention a very recent paper by Eric Hull. He proposed another measure of emergence, and basically he tries to measure which scales irreducibly contribute to a system's causal workings. So he tries to go beyond the subjectivity of the observer in describing emergence by trying to measure the causality between scales. But then we run into the problem of causality that we just mentioned. So it's like, okay, we will try to solve the problem of emergence with causality, but then causality suffers almost the same problems. But in some cases, it might be useful. So it's ongoing work. And like many theories, we will see whether it will be useful or not. Because, for example, if it's very difficult to get the system's causal workings at multiple scales from experimental data, then it might make sense intuitively, but you cannot apply it easily. I'll give as an example Fisher information, which in some cases can be seen as the derivative of Shannon information. That it can be useful for many cases, but basically to calculate feature information, you need to, it's basically how much information you gain when you vary a system, when you perturb a system. But in many cases, you cannot perturb a system and then measure what's the information gain you got after the perturbation. So there, even if we wanted, we cannot use feature information because we just have one instance of the system, or we cannot we can perturb the system, but then we will get the information of the perturbed system and not the information of the non-perturbed system. Yeah. So, I mean, just to repeat, there's also the question whether causality is subjective or objective, and ontologically there are no scales. Let's say, in order to speak about which scales irreducibly contribute to the cause of workings. So, I mean, information is relative to the agent perceiving it. So even if we speak about ontology of information, it will have certain subjectivity. Okay, so for next week, we will read these papers, but I forget which ones are for Thursday. Yeah. Let me see. No, or it was for this week? I forget. It was this week, right? Yes. Yes, for next week, we will discuss about cellular automata. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, questions, comments?
If you could discuss about the final project. Thank you.
Yes.
So if you could discuss and give us some ideas about the final project, earlier it could be better so that we can take preparations and stuff.
Yes. So the idea about the final project is there will be teams of about 3 people, and then you work on a topic of your choice, but that should be related to the class. And then we will brainstorm in a few weeks. Well, no, you should start brainstorming because in a few weeks you will come already with proposals, and then we will brainstorm over your proposals. So if you want to start forming teams, you can use Brightspace for it, or also here. So there's no necessity of having, I mean, there are also online students, I forget how many, because the number is still going up. And so feel free to include in your teams online students, and online students can also organize, so we can have either only remote students in a team or part or only on-site students. So there's no restriction for that. Yeah.
Thank you. As it is kind of new subject and field to many of us, if you could provide us some materials or help us brainstorm about the ideas for the project or topic.
Yes.
That would be useful for our resumes as well.
Yes, I'll put on Brightspace a list of potential projects, and then let's say you don't need to pick one of those, but you can pick one of those. So, for example, last semester I made such a list, but then there were 3 teams working on one of the topics, which was interesting because they all kind of took a different perspective on the same topic. So again, it's not restrictive that if one team already chose one topic, that means that the other teams cannot choose that topic. Yeah. Okay, so
Is there a number as far as the teams? A maximum?
so usually the final project is just you mean the number of people in the team?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, three maximum, and
Thank you.
hopefully minimum as well. Yes, so I'll tell you a bit about NetLogo. So it's a multi-agent system. It has its origins in Logo, which was developed by Seymour Papert in '68, with the purpose of teaching kids how to program. Actually, when I was 6, I started. My dad took me to some programming class in Mexico City, organized by the Mexican Academy of Sciences. It was precisely using Logo, and then in elementary school, we were also using Logo. And you can learn about geometry and some other things. It's very easy. So um, let's say you have turtles. Let me make this a bit bigger. Okay. So let's say we have turtles, and then turtle, where are you? I mean, if I click on the turtle, here we are. Okay, so now I can control the turtle. So I mean, you have here lots of variables, but then you can ask turtle to move around. They have pens, and you can change the color of the pen. So I asked to put the pen down, so the down or up, and then I can ask it to go forward 10 steps. So FD 10, I can ask it to turn right turn 90 degrees, and then do the same, and then do the same, then do the same, and then do the same. And like that, you make a square. So it's like very simple. And then you do the same with 120 degrees and it's triangles. So that's like the basic things that you can do, that you could do with Logo already in the 60s and 80s and so on. And then, well, Seymour Papert has been in MIT already since those years, and they started doing Star Logo, which instead of having one turtle, it was already many turtles. So let's say now let's create, well, so let's say now we can create, I don't know, 10 turtles. They're all there. And then we can ask all of them, put your pen down, move forward. What happened? Yeah. And then So you can suddenly do multi-agent simulations because now every turtle is an agent and you can address them, all of them in parallel, or each turtle has its own functions and procedures, and then they can do their own things, and then they can interact, they can detect each other. So it's like the basis for multi-agent simulation. So that was star logo, and then there was separation. So Uri Wilensky started from Star Logo and developed Net Logo at Northwestern. I forget in which year, but like 30 years ago. And NetLogo has been used more for multi-agent systems and modeling, so it's more scientific. And then you have tools for it, and we will see more about it. But just to finish the story, there was another branch of Star Logo called Star Logo The Next Generation, just like Star Trek, and that went more into teaching visual programming to kids. So, and that evolved into Scratch, which you might know. So let's see. So Scratch, it's it's like fully focused on kids learning how to program. And let me see. I mean, kids do like animations or games or things like that. Well, I just wanted to show a bit. Oh yeah. So I don't know what's this. Tutorial get started. So anyway, it's visual programming. So for kids, it's easier because they don't need to type. So you basically drag and drop these blocks. So this will be like FD10. And then here you can change how many steps and then turn clockwise this amount of degrees. So like 90 degrees. And then there should be like a repeat. And then this would make a square, no? Like I was doing in NetLogo. Yeah, so that's more for kids. If you have kids, play with Scratch. It's lots of fun. And but let's go back to NetLogo. So multi-agent simulation, we'll see more about agents in general. But then we can have, for example, there's this model of flocking. So like some groups of birds flock, like starling murmurations. And late 80s, Craig Reynolds, who's a member of the artificial life community, was working at Disney and created this algorithm of so-called voids with 3 simple rules. Basically, each void has certain radius, and then try to align to the average alignment of your neighbors in that radius, try to keep the similar speed, and try not to crash. And with those simple rules, you get this type of behavior. And here you can, let's say, reduce the radius or increase the radius. And then, okay, you can allow them to get closer together or separate them a bit more. And and then can change the coherence, the alignment. So this algorithm became famous because it was used, I think, in the Batman Returns film with the bats going out of the Batcave, and that's earned Craig an Oscar for best animation. I think not only for that, but let's say that was one of the aspects. And then physicists started using very similar models. So there's the Vichek model from physics. There's the Kusan model from biology, which is the same but with equations instead of algorithms, and they're still being studied, and then there are variations on this. And Hiroki Sayama has been developing this swarm chemistry, which is partially inspired by this type of models. So here in the code, well, here you have 3 tabs. So the interface, you can play with the buttons and everything. And the information in models basically tells us what it is about and what to do, what you can play with. So I encourage you to open the models library. So you go to File, Models Library, and then play with all the models that are there. You can go to the Info tab or just play in the interface. And then you can go to the code, and like that you can get an idea of how it works. It also has documentation. So for example, if you want to know how to use repeat, you can click on a word, you get quick help. And then here it says like how to use the syntax, gives you an example. Or you can just go to the NetLogo dictionary, and here there are all the different functions and primitives that you have. It also has tutorials. So here, let's say tutorial number 0, number 1. So I mean, it's really easy to learn on your own. And if we look at the code, let's say the turtles are agents. So here you declare some variables. So this would be an agent sets, basically their neighbors, and this would be one agent, the neighbor. But like in some other programming languages, you don't need to declare the type of variable. You just assign. When you assign, then this variable will get the type of which is being assigned. So this procedure setup is called with the button. So first you create the procedure to set up, and then let's say when you create a button, then you say, oh, just run the process setup. And here we can create like other button, and then I don't know. So let's say the commands would be to ask all the turtles to put their pen down, and then the display name if you want it differently. And so basically this can go down, and then I press, and then they leave the trace because they're with their pens down. Yeah. Of course, we can do another to to put the pen up, another to erase all the traces and things like that. But anyway, so when you press it up, this clear all erases everything and create turtles of population, and then population is this variable. So when you create a slider, so it creates a global variable with this name, and then you can play with the values that this variable can take. So we can change it, and we'll get different population. And then it puts the color different shades of yellow, size a bit bigger, random coordinates, and then you the flockmates variable will be an empty agent set, and ticks it's just the clock. And then here go is always, let's say when you press it one, if you click here forever, then it goes forever. If not, then you need to press it. So it executes once, then you need to press it again and again and again and again and again. So that's why forever is useful. It just keeps on repeating as long as this is pressed. It keeps on repeating the code inside this procedure. Of course, we can change the name here, but then we need to change the name in the button as well. So you ask turtles to flock, which is another function. And then you ask the turtles to move slowly 5 times so that the display is a bit smoother and they're not like jumping. And tick just moves the clock 1 time step. So flock, it's what all turtles do every time step. First, they find their flockmates, and if they have some flockmates, because it might be that they don't have any flockmates, then they don't do anything. Then they find their nearest neighbors, and then if they're not about to collide, then they separate, and if not, they adhere and cohere. So if they're too close to a neighbor, they move, and if not, they align and cohere. So first they find flockmates, which is basically you set the variable flockmates as other turtles in the radius of vision. So all these in purple are inbuilt functions and variables. So it's very easy to manipulate. I mean, you don't need to program much in order to get all these functions for agent interaction. And then the nearest neighbors, you set this variable as the minimum one of the flockmates with distance of myself. This is one of because it might be that there's more than one flockmate with the same minimum distance, but it's usually just one. And then if there are more, then just choose one randomly. And then to separate, it turns away with a certain heading from the nearest neighbors. And then this maximum separate term, it's this degree. And that's it. And then to align, you turn towards the average flockmate heading with the maximum align turn, which is this degree. And then there's this function to calculate this average flockmate heading. So it's basically you get the average position of your flockmates, and then you report the heading, and then the arc tangent of the x component, y component, that gives you the alignment of all of them. And then to cohere, you turn towards the average heading, and then the average heading is calculated like this. And then turn towards, turn away, which are used somewhere here. Turn at most. Yeah. So all of these use these angles so that the turtles turn, but not more than the maximum that you are setting. Yeah, so that's more or less how it works. And I mean, again, there are many different models you can play with. Feel free to explore. And yeah. For your final project, you might want to do a simulation in NetLogo or take one of the models and then make it more sophisticated. One of the final projects did that with this model of wolf sheep predation. So here you have wolves that eat sheep that eat grass, and then you have this population dynamics of how many sheep and wolves there are. Then let's assume that sheep gain more from food, so then there will be more sheep. Then if there are more sheep, there are more wolves, and if there are more wolves, then they eat more sheep, and then start having oscillations. And they almost go extinct, and the wolves went extinct, and without any predators, the sheep go wild, and then there's not enough food for everybody, so their population collapses and only later stabilizes more or less. So yeah, they were playing with this, extending this model. Okay. Any question, comments? Okay, so then see you on Thursday for the discussion. Yep.